Okay, so continuing our discussion of angiosperms, we talked about complete flowers in the last video. Now we're going to talk about incomplete flowers. So these are flowers that are lacking one or more of those four parts of the plant, right? And so what are the four parts, right? The sepals, the petals, the andrecium, or the male parts of the flowers, and the gynoecium, or the female parts of the flowers. So now we're going to talk about incomplete flowers and talk about floral evolution and some of the features of incomplete flowers and why those might be advantageous. And then the second part of this lecture, we'll talk about pollination, which is pretty fun and interesting to talk about. We'll have some great examples there. I hope that all of you are getting outside at least to some degree, whether you're on campus still or if you're at home. And, you know, it's really great to take the people you're bubbled with out on tree walks, but sometimes you find that your audience is not quite as receptive as you hoped you are, and they're not quite as excited about what you've learned as you are. So just keep that in mind, but hopefully you've learned enough about leaves and plants to get the humor that's in this, even though I don't think we've learned black walnut yet. So, so far we've learned that the most primitive families in the Angiosperms tend to have multiple floral parts. And we learned about a few examples of primitive tree families. That's the Magnoliaceae, right, which contains our tulip tree, the Lauraceae, which contains sassafras, Calycanthaceae, which includes calycanthus or sweet shrub, and Ananaceae, which contains pawpaw. And the flower on the right are Lindera benzoin, so that's in the Lauraceae family. That's one we'll learn this semester. So when you have flowers that are more highly evolved, we talked about the urn-shaped flowers in Ericaceae. So this is an indicator that this is a more evolved flower part. And this is something we're going to talk about, more advanced flowers that we can see in woody plants, which is the focus for our course. So fusion of plant parts, you can see that in Gaylissacia frondosa. This is another Heath family member. And you might have figured out that it was Ericaceae because it has those little urn-shaped flowers that hang down. We also have two species in the Rosaceae family. So Amelanchier arborea and Prunus serotina. You can see both of these are in the Rosaceae family. And so the sepals have fused together, or I'm sorry, not the sepals, but the ovaries are slightly different and have fused together. It's a little bit hard to see from those photos. But that can be an indicator that this is a more advanced or evolved plant family. You can also see in both of those that the petals are fives in both Amelanchier and Prunus. Then we'll talk about changes in symmetry and also floral reduction, which we only just started talking about in the last slide. So here's our Cercis canadensis flower again. When we're talking about change in symmetry, we can see those parts that are familiar, right? They do contain the sepals, the petals, the pistils, and the stamens, right? So male and female parts, the petals, and the sepals. But you can see the symmetry is a little bit different. Let's talk a little bit more about symmetry. So many flowers, and especially primitive ones, are radially symmetrical, and that's called actinomorphic. And if you look at the diagram to the left, the one on the left, letter A, you can see that you can divide that flower from the top any of a number of different ways, and the flower is basically symmetrical. So, you know, when you can divide the flower into many different planes, we would call it radially symmetrical or actinomorphic. We have examples of bilaterally symmetrical flowers, right, which we would call zygomorphic. These are flowers that still are of symmetry, but really only divisible on one plane. So some of those pea flowers, right, so the example of Robinia pseudoacacia in the photograph, you can see has this bilateral symmetry. And so we would call those flowers zygomorphic. And so that's an indicator of a more specialized or more evolved flower. We also have floral reduction. And so this is something where you have fewer parts in the plant. And we learned Fagus grandifolia in lab, and you can see these are the most amazing flowers for American beech. This is what they look like in the spring. It's one of those things that once you see them, you wonder where they came from, and then you get to learn about beech flowers. And I don't know if you can see in the photograph, but this is mostly stamens. The flower is mostly stamens, so it's an imperfect flower, incomplete flower. So you can have floral reduction. We're going to talk about this a little bit more in a couple of ways. So the flowers can become imperfect, right? So that means they're either male flowers or female flowers. And if you remember back to an earlier lecture, right, monoecious plants have both male and female flowers on the same tree, but they're separate, right? The flowers themselves are either male or they're female. So they can occur on the same tree, or they can occur on different individuals, right? So that in that case, we call them dioecious. Okay, so that's a little bit of review from last week. Also, you can have polygomodioecious, right? So there's a 50-cent word for you. These are plants that are mostly dioecious. So most of them are separate individuals, but sometimes they'll have male and female on the same plant. You can also have polygomonoecious. And so that's mostly monoecious plants, but some individuals are dioecious. Okay, those are words we don't hear quite as often, but I do want you to know what they are. So other ways that floral reduction can happen, flowers can become imperfect, right? So they become single male or single female. You can also have flowers that are incomplete, but they're still perfect. So what does that mean? So that means that they lack either petals or sepals or both, but they can still have pistils and stamens, right? So remember, incomplete means it's missing one of those 4 essential parts of flowers, whereas imperfect means it's missing either the male or the female flowers. So why would you have a case of having an incomplete flower, right? So if you have flowers that are missing sepals or petals, right? The advantage of that, like we saw in the beech photo in the last slide, is that the anthers are now exposed. And so most pollen, especially in trees, is windborne. It's very, very small. And so in some ways, the petals and sepals kind of get in the way with how far that pollen can travel. So that might be an advantage. And you see lots of examples of trees that have apetalous or asepalous flowers. And often these flowers, these are trees that flower before the leaves come out on trees. So again, very early spring, when the branches are exposed, because that's an evolutionary advantage for that pollen to travel as far as it can. So you can also, if you don't produce some floral structures, that means you have more energy to put into pollen production or other reproductive parts. And so you can have more pollen produced. You can increase the size of your stigma. So if you're trying to be successful, you want to have plenty of landing room for the pollen. And so that's another way where there might be an energy reallocation if you don't put energy into producing petals and sepals. You can also have floral reduction happen, which combines these things, right? So you can have staminate flowers with only sepals. So what does that mean? Staminate flowers are male flowers only. Okay, and so they have sepals to protect them before they open, but they may lack petals and they may lack female parts. So in this case, a flower that is staminate with only sepals would be called both incomplete and imperfect. Some examples here, so you can look at these imperfect flowers. So in this case, on the left side, you can see these are incomplete and imperfect flowers for Sassafras albidum, which is in the Lauraceae, which is one of the more primitive plants. On the left, you can see the female flowers because you can see the carpel there that's exposed. And then on the right, you can see it looks like mostly male flowers. And then an example of a monoecious plant in the Betulaceae is Corylus americana. So this is American hazel. And what's really cool about these is that you see the male catkins, which are the dangling parts on the right. So that contains the pollen. And then the female stigma you can see is bright pink, and it's on the left at the very end of that twig. So that's an example of monoecious flowers, where the male and female parts are on the male and female flowers are on the same plant, but a little bit physically removed from each other. So those are examples of imperfect flowers where there's missing one of the 4 types of tissues. Another example that's really common to see, and I want you to look for this next spring, even though you won't be in dendrology anymore, is Acer rubrum. And so they're separate male and female flowers. Male flowers on the left, you can see those stamens jutting out, right? So they're releasing their pollen in the wind. And so it's great that those are so exposed. And you can see there's little sepals at the bottom, but there's not petals. And they're not female parts. The female flowers are shown on the right. And again, it looks like those are sepals. And then you can see the stigmas, which are in pairs angling out from the ends of the flowers. And what's really cool is to see the fruits develop from that. I had to put that in. So those female flowers in the center photograph eventually develop, and you can still see those sepals right at the base, right? Those red structures here are the same that are here, but now that the pollen has traveled and the ovule has been fertilized, it's developing into these mature seeds. So these are the someros, or the winged seeds, that develop after the ovule is fertilized. A really cool example to see there, and it's some of those things that you maybe never noticed it before, but now you know to look for it. We also have examples of Quercus. This is Quercus alba, or white oak. And you can see the male flowers are catkins, sort of a zoomed in photo down here at the bottom left, right, with stamens, right, and also sepals. So sepals protect it while it's on the tree before it opens, and then they open up and release the pollen to the wind. And then the female flowers look quite different. And these are what develop into the acorns. And again, this progression, if you look at the photo in the center and then the photo on the right, you can see the developing acorns, right? Those are from the female flowers that were pollinated. And then what the catkins look like, or the male flowers, on the bottom right. So again, another example of an incomplete, imperfect flower, right? So it's missing one of those 4 parts, which you can clearly see. And you can see there's separate male and female flowers. One more example from Fagaceae is Castanea, right? So this is our American chestnut. And you can see the male flowers on the left that look quite a lot like the same Quercus oak flowers, and it's in the same family. And then the female flowers are at the base. And so those are what develop into those prickly fruits. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about pollination biology and ecology. So we just already talked a little bit about these evolutionary advantages for floral reduction. Why would you not want to have all 4 of your parts for flowers, right? So here's a really important one. If you have the male and female parts in the same flower, you risk selfing, right? So this is self-pollination, right? What's the advantage of that might be that if there's no other game in town, you can at least produce fruit. But it's far better to have sexual recombination happen, right? To mix genetic material from other plants. And so if you have only male or only female flowers, you reduce that likelihood that you'll be self-pollinated. So that's a big advantage, right? If you don't have petals or other things in the way and you flower in early spring, you have a better chance for wind pollination. A lot of pollen can scatter in the wind in early spring before the leaves are out. We already talked about how you can allocate energy towards the more functional parts, right? The basic male and female flowers. So you could, for example, produce more pollen, or you could have a larger style, or maybe more ovules. And so when we're talking about pollination, before we jump into a little bit more, what we're talking about is the transfer of pollen from the anther, right, where it's produced on the male part of the plant, part of the stamen, to the stigma, which is the top of the carpel, which collects pollen. And so here's a basic diagram of pollination happening in one of your classic flowers. So we have our pollinator, in this case is a bee. And so it collects pollen that sticks to the bee's legs. You can see it in the center photo. You can often see insects with these little pollen sacs on their legs. And when the bee travels to another plant of the same type, right, that pollen can stick to the stigmas and travel down to fertilize the flower. So this is how this happens, at least from an insect pollination standpoint. And so what happens after pollination? So pollination and fertilization are not the same thing. So remember, pollination is that transfer of pollen from the anther, or the male part of the flower, to the stigma, or the top of the carpel. So after a pollen grain gets there, right, so the pollen grain starts growing, and so it grows this pollen tube that goes down into the style. Now, if it's the wrong species of pollen, if it's from a different type of tree or flower, it will not, those pollen won't grow. There's also some evidence that shows that some pollen from the same flower will not grow on its own stigma. So that reduces the chance of self-fertilization. In any case, if the pollen lands on the stigma and it is the same flower species, then this pollen tube begins to grow down towards the ovary. And so the pollen tube grows down, and then the sperm follow right behind it. And so as that pollen tube grows into the ovary, it fuses with the egg cell, and that's when fertilization happens, right? So when the sperm and egg meet and fuse. So what's the difference between an ovule and a seed? So these are very important terms too. When we're talking about ovules, we're talking about the immature seed. So this is what's down in the ovary before fertilization happens, right? When we talk about seeds, that is a mature or fertilized and developed ovule. So the ovule can be fertilized, needs to be fertilized before it turns into a seed. And so it's important, this is probably a review for you, but I don't want you to mix those terms up. So fertilization and pollination are not interchangeable terms. Okay, so the ovule has to be fertilized first, then it develops into a seed. So let's talk a little bit about pollination vectors in trees in the temperate zone, which is where we are. So the most primitive plants, as we discussed before, were insect pollinated. And so that includes our Magnoliaceae, and then later Ericaceae and Rosaceae. So these are all trees that rely on insects for pollination. And these are also families that have showy flowers, right? So we know about magnolias, and we've seen examples of blueberry flowers, and also members of the rose family. So cherries, which are often planted for beauty and aesthetics. And so those petals are functioning as a way to bring in pollinators, right? So if you were requiring insects to pollinate you, you need a way to attract them. And that's the primary function of petals. The wind pollinated species in general evolved later on, and most of our trees are wind pollinated. So that includes Fagaceae, so our oaks, and also Betulaceae, which are the birches. Just some examples, but most of our trees are wind pollinated. We do have a few species of trees that are bird pollinated. And so the easiest example to think about is hummingbird pollinated. I'm going to start this video real quick so you can see. So you have to look carefully, and hopefully you're not getting seasick, but here's our hummingbird pollinating a beautiful Aesculus pavia, is a coastal species of buckeye. And you can see these red tubular flowers are really got perfect architecture for hummingbirds to pop in and pollinate them. From the hummingbird standpoint, these red buckeye flowers are some of the earliest flowers to open in the early spring, and so it's a really important nectar resource for flowers. So this is taking a while to load, so I'm going to X out of here and go back. Also, similarly, later in the season, the albizia, right, our mimosa tree, is also hummingbird pollinated, and they have those really showy flowers out there. So I just have made this little quick list to compare insect and wind pollinated flowers. And that way, if you're looking at flowers, you can sort of think about whether it's probably insect or wind pollinated. So in insect pollination, flowers are usually complete and perfect, right? So they have all 4 types of tissue. They have male and female parts. Sometimes they are incomplete and imperfect, in which case they don't have all four parts and they're missing the male or the females. Wind pollinated are often complete and imperfect, right? So it has, it may have all the parts, but it may be missing sepals or petals, right? Because those actually get in the way if you're wind pollinated. And so insect pollinated have petals, right, to attract the insects, and often sepals. Wind pollinated ones, those are often absent. Insect pollination, right? So if you are trying to get insects to take your pollen, you need your pollen to be large and also sticky. And wind pollinated plants, right, you just want your pollen to fly. So you have very small pollen that flies through the air. Insect pollinated plants have flowers that different times of the year, whereas wind pollinated ones tend to be early before the leaves emerge, so it can travel farther. Insect pollinators often have a nectary. So this is a reward. This attracts insects to the plant to begin with, not necessary in wind pollinated. And insect pollinated includes a lot of our shrubs and also a few trees, whereas wind pollinated is the majority of trees. Wind pollinated ones are also our seasonal allergies. If you think about particulates like pollen, the smaller the particulate, the more likely it is to be an allergen. So that's something I'll show you a slide in just a moment that illustrates that. So in conclusion, most of our trees that are insect or bird pollinated have some sort of reward, right? So some kind of nectar or pollen that attracts them. So here's a photo of Raleigh in early spring. I think this is taken, I can't remember where it's taken exactly. You can see the air is yellow. And so if you have just arrived at NC State and you've not spent a spring in North Carolina yet, you should be prepared. Now this yellow pollen, interestingly, is from pines in the Piedmont, specifically loblolly pine. But this is not the pollen that people are so allergic to. So people are generally allergic to oak pollen. And so the reason for that is pine pollen is actually quite large. It's too large to function as a particulate, one that can be sucked into our lungs, right? Whereas particulates that are much smaller, like oak pollen, tend to function much more often as an allergen. And so people see this yellow pollen, they blame the pines, but in reality, it's the oaks with the smaller wind dispersed pollen that are causing most of our allergic reactions. So we can also have terms that I just want to mention before we finish. Cross-pollination, this is the more desirable from an evolutionary standpoint. That's when you have pollination between two or more individual trees, right? So that mixes up the genetic material. But in cases where those trees are isolated, it might be evolutionary advantageous to be a self-pollinating plant where you can actually self-pollinate if there's nothing else around. And interestingly, this can be a dynamic kind of trait. So loblolly pine, very little of it can be self-pollinated, right? So there's a wind dispersed species for pollination, right? Wind pollinated species. And so that the pollen might land in the right spot, but it won't develop because that is an evolutionary trait of pine. So I want to wrap up with one more example of, this is a little bit trivia, but I think it's really interesting. So the question, do Venus flytraps eat their pollinators, right? So this is an example of a really unique plant, a carnivorous plant, not a tree, that grows in a 70-mile radius around Wilmington, North Carolina. It's the only place in the world where Venus flytraps are found. And so it stands to reason that you might be concerned that, how does this plant continue to survive if it's an insect-eating plant? And so my colleague, Dr. Elsa Youngstadt, who is a new professor in the Department of Applied Ecology at NC State, made this discovery by looking at the flowers of Venus flytraps and also looking at the leaves to see what kinds of insects were consumed. And I linked the article here, but the headline of the article is a really wonderful scientific finding. Venus flytraps do not eat their pollinators. And so you can see, if you look on the right, this was a theory, this was her hypothesis, that they probably don't eat their pollinators. But in order to really be sure, you have to measure how and why. So you can see on the right that the flowers actually stand about a foot above the leaves, right? You can see the little trap leaves here on the bottom that are highly specialized. And you can see that the flowers are about a foot above. So the insect pollinators tend to be flying insects, whereas the insects they were finding inside the traps were mostly crawling insects like beetles. So really important finding, and also an incredibly cool study. So just to wrap up really quick, so here's a quick recap. I want you to think about this. Imperfect flowers are always incomplete, but incomplete flowers may or may not be imperfect. So that is a true statement. And if you find that confusing, I want you to think about it to make sure you understand the distinction in those terms. So remember, complete flowers have 4 parts: the sepals, the petals, the male andrecium, and the female gynecium. So imperfect flowers is lacking one or more of those parts. Okay, when we're talking about perfect flowers, they have both male and female. But you could have complete flower, or I'm sorry, you can have incomplete flowers that have perfect, that are still perfect, right? They still have male and female parts, but maybe they're missing the sepals or the petals. Okay, and then we have certainly examples of incomplete flowers that are imperfect. Our least evolved and oldest, most primitive plant families that have not changed significantly, and we can see the evidence for that in the flowers, are Magnoliaceae, Lauraceae, Calycanthaceae, and Ananaceae. And we will learn species in lab from all of these families. So when you have natural selection happen over time, right, you have flowers that have evolved in various ways that give them an evolutionary advantage. So that might look like fused parts. It could look like changes in symmetry, or it could look like floral reduction, where the most important parts of the flower continue, but other parts that are less essentially are reduced. Remember that pollination is that physical transfer of pollen from the anther, right, where it's produced, to the stigma, the female part of a flower. So once that pollen reaches the stigma, you could say the plant has been pollinated. But remember also that it's not fertilized until that pollen tube has grown down and the sperm and egg have joined. That's what fertilization happens. And we have examples of flowers that have co-evolved with their pollinators. So we didn't talk about that a whole lot, but there's certainly some very specialized flowers. Orchids are the most well-known example of flowers that have co-evolved with the pollinators, where the flowers have evolved in response to a specific pollinator. The pollinator has no other host flower. And then just to understand, there are evolutionary advantages of all these different types. Otherwise, we would only have one kind. But when you have many kinds, it depends on the situation as to which is the most evolutionarily advantageous. So that's something to keep in mind. This sort of answers this grander question of why do we see, so much diversity in these different floral structures. And that's a wrap. Next week, we'll talk about gymnosperms.